Thank you to the guys and girls at EA for letting me check out this update early. Kinda cold here in Lakeshore, don't you think? Alright, so as some of you know, Need for Speed Unbound is going to get its first, like, big substantial content update in the form of Volume 2, is what they called it. And EA has reached out to me and asked me if I could check it out, so I've been mostly playing it over the last weekend, trying to see what changed, trying to see what's different. And yeah, this is just me giving my full-on opinion on this, completely unfiltered, just what I think. So just to get you up to speed on what the multiplayer update actually had in store this time around, in case for whatever reason you didn't watch the trailer or something like that. The big one was definitely cops in multiplayer. That was primarily what they focused on, and I think rightfully so. Like, if you just think about everything that Need for Speed Unbound was lacking, you could probably come up with a lot of things, but Cops and Unbound is definitely like somewhere at the top of the list. Not just because Heat had it, and I think a lot of other Need for Speeds, it's just like Cops is just Need for Speed. Need for Speed and Cops is just like, you know, like. So having that in online just made a lot of sense, and I'm glad that they finally actually got around to adding it. In addition to that, we also had 3 new cars that got added to the game, one of them being the Lotus Emira, but the Balmain edition, and an epic custom of the Fair Lady. Initially, those 2 were the only ones that got announced. Like, they kept like the last car a secret, and now we can finally share what that car is. It is a Maybach, which I actually quite like. At first I was kind of like, okay, but the more you think about it, the more it just makes sense. Obviously, there's like a lot of cars the community wants to see, like a G35 or, you know, cars from previous Need for Speeds. But if you really think about what does Unbound not actually have yet, it's like a limousine, like a straight up luxury limousine. And I think that adding this one is kind of perfect because it adds one to the game. I think it really does fit to Unbound as well, so thumbs up, I like it. Now, cars and cops is obviously not everything. In addition to that, we had 40 new daily challenges as well as 15 regular challenges. They are sort of similar, and I think they should probably come up with different names between like a daily challenge and a regular challenge. I think just from the name you don't really know what the difference is. Basically, regular challenges are always doable, and they're usually like a little bit more specific and can win you some cars. For example, the Maybach is actually only winnable if you get 30 stars from the newly added Hot Laps, which is like a new activity, just like drift zones or speed zones or whatever, where you basically have to drive around like a course, and depending on how fast you were, you got somewhere between 1 or 3 stars, and you need a total of 30 of them to actually be able to buy the Maybach in the first place. Now keep in mind that doesn't mean you actually have to get 3 stars in all of them. I think usually it's enough to get like 2 stars or 1 star. It's like somewhere in the middle. So even if you don't have like super maxed out cars, or you may just not be as good in the game, don't worry. You can still get it. It's fine. It's not that hard. In terms of multiplayer updates, we also have new playlists, which I think is great. As well as the existing playlists, they also got a refresh, which is fantastic because a lot of people were already complaining that things got a little bit repetitive and the race routes were a little bit too, you know, they popped up a little bit too much and there weren't enough of them. So them actually adding more of that is also definitely a good thing. And everything I've mentioned so far is free, with the exception of the 240Z custom. We'll get back to that. But in addition to that, they actually released some paid DLC. One of them being the Keys to the Map DLC. Now, I'm pretty sure you're already familiar with this if you played previous Need for Speeds. Basically, it's like a cheap auto-unlocker, if you will, which basically just makes everything on the map, like collectibles and zones and whatever, just makes all of that visible without you actually needing to find it in the first place. And last but not least, we also got some clothing items, which, I mean, I'm actually a fan of character customization. I haven't really like looked into it too much, but yeah, if you're into that sort of stuff, there you go. Something that isn't in my notes right now, but I just remembered, I think they also added some driving effects and emotes, which is cool, for sure. But what's definitely more interesting about particularly the driving effects is something that we'll get to in just a bit. But yeah, that was everything that got announced at first, in terms of like what was actually in the trailer. And interestingly enough, that actually caused some backlash initially. There was a large group of people that was complaining that this just isn't enough for the last like 3 months that they worked on the game, and that, you know, they would have rather seen some fixes to the existing game, yada yada yada. And the thing is, yes, but that's also exactly what they did. So yes, everything that was shown in the initial trailer was actually only like half the story. I'm not sure why they didn't also include like everything that they were actually improving into the video, like into the trailer itself. But there's actually a lot more to it than everything that I've just been naming. I mean, let's just start by looking at the list of bug fixes. It is actually so long, you could probably make a whole Star Wars intro out of it. Like, There's a long list, and I'm honestly not gonna read up all of it, but you can read it for yourself if you want to. But this is actually where we get to the big stuff, and also the really important stuff. And let's just start off by highlighting the better multiplayer payouts. This is something that almost everyone was agreeing on that was just not really good. That if you go into multiplayer races, and even if it's a full lobby and you win, the payouts are just nowhere near enough, especially with how much the cars in the game can cost. It just wasn't really good enough. And lo and behold, they actually addressed it. So I was doing some races with some other people in the community in the early access phase that we had last weekend. And full stop, I lost pretty much all of the playlists. It was also only like half filled, like we never actually had a full lobby going. I think the max we had was like 4 or 5 players. And the least amount I got being in last in a half filled lobby was 30k, which all things considered is not even that bad. I think 30k was what you had before if you were first in like a somewhat filled lobby. Now I think it's like 80k. I've seen some people in the community getting like up to 80,000 credits for winning in a full lobby, which is a huge upgrade. Now moving on to another big improvement for the multiplayer is the fix for the B-class Pista. And for that matter also any car you could basically downgrade more than 2 classes that would end up being overpowered as a result. I think the Pista single-handedly killed almost every single B-class racing playlist. So to see that finally addressed so that you can actually like do some proper races in B-class as well, and also all the other classes, is definitely fantastic. With that there have also been various other balancing improvements. Honestly, I haven't really gotten around to testing all of them out because I'm actually not even that far into the game yet, especially not the multiplayer, but yeah, it's definitely nice to see all of that addressed. Another maybe small thing, at least it sounds kind of small initially, but I think it's actually huge in terms of just playability, is that now if you enter a playlist, you can actually change your car between every race, which is fantastic, because oftentimes you have like races that, you know, maybe have more turns, maybe a little bit more off-road, and you may have different cars that serve different purposes. So now you can actually swap out cars in between playlists, which I think is also another good one. But moving on from all the multiplayer improvements, there have also been a numerous amount of improvements that don't just affect the multiplayer but the experience as a whole. And one that I personally really appreciate is that now you can actually choose the driving effects per car. I'm not sure why this wasn't a thing in the base game, but they basically changed it from it being in a way where you can only assign driving effects generally. So you would basically choose a driving effect, and the moment you do, it would get applied on every single car. And the moment you want to change cars, you also have to change the driving effect, because the one you have selected may not necessarily fit to the car you were driving, or you just switch to basically. And now the driving effects, so the smoke, the effects, and even the sounds if you want to, all of that is now tied to the car, which I think makes so much more sense. And I think it actually improves the customization by a substantial amount. Now, one that I think a lot of people are pretty happy to hear is that you can now skip music tracks. I know a lot of you guys weren't really a fan of the soundtrack, and I've been kind of like on it too. I actually think there are some tracks in the soundtrack that are fine, like it's not all trash. I think some of them were actually kind of good, but there were also some yeah, well, I'm definitely gonna be pressing the skip button in the future, that's for sure. And then lastly, I just want to highlight the improvements to collisions. This was something that actually got highlighted very recently, and I think it was White Light's video on Unbound, where the collisions were just kind of weird, where sometimes you can hit something really hard and it doesn't crash out your car, and other times you hit something very lightly and it does. And also like how, no matter how small the crash and how like low speed it was, the car would always tumble. All of that has been addressed, and so far I haven't really had any weird moments with collisions. Like every time I actually crashed out, it felt justified, and it just feels better overall, which is another really good thing. But yeah, that about rounds it up for, I think, Volume 2 is what they call it now in Unbound, and I gotta say, it is a pretty decent update. I know it's kind of been a popular thing to just kind of like hate on new games and hate on Need for Speed, but I just gotta say, like, this is definitely much better than I'm used to with other racing games nowadays. I actually think it's a great thing that they focused more on fixes and improvements to existing issues, rather than just further inflating the game with more and more content that people may not have been asking for at all. I don't want to call out any game specifically in this video, but there's definitely a lot of games where the devs or publishers or whoever thinks it's fine to just add like a couple of cars every month and call it a day without actually addressing any of the major issues. And that's something that honestly just really annoys me, because just adding a few cars into the game doesn't really make the game any better. It just further inflates it even more. So I think that this approach that Unbound is taking, where they're like, hey, you know, let's listen to the community, see what they say, see what we can fix with the next update, and them actually going out of their way to do it is a great approach, and it's something that I wish we would see more often in other racing games. It's just a shame that they didn't really make like that the center point of the news. As I said earlier, the trailer was all about the new content, which obviously isn't all that much considering they were actually busy with fixes and improvements, which, as I said, is a great thing. And so I really wish that, you know, they rethink their communication for future updates, because the second wave of responses they got once they actually announced all the improvements was much better. And I hope that with the next update they can just kind of like let the cat out of the bag and say like, alright, here's what we improved this time around and here's what's new. So that we can have like, you know, not this situation again, because it was kind of unfortunate. But the $1 million question at the end of the day is, does this save Unbound? Because the state of Unbound was pretty dwindling. Like, player counts were dropping pretty rapidly, I'd say, in around January and especially February. And the question now is, will this update actually revitalize the player counts? Will this actually be something that brings players back? And that's where I'm not super sure. I think it really just boils down whether or not you liked the initial game or not. If you were someone who didn't like the, you know, art style, you didn't like the map, you didn't like the bare basics of the game, I don't think the update changes the game in any dramatic ways to make you change your opinion. Full stop. However, if there were only like very specific things you had issues with, like for example the low payouts in multiplayer, or, you know, generally you liked the game, but there was just a few minor things here and there that you would have liked to see improved, then honestly I think it might just be worth checking back into with Unbound. And yeah, if you liked the game before, you're probably already busy playing the updates and are probably having a lot of fun. I think if we're talking about longevity when it comes to Unbound and, you know, with how many people actually play the multiplayer, I think a lot of it is still sadly hampered by the matchmaking system, which is just something that I feel obligated to bring up. So in case you're not aware, the way matchmaking works in Unbound is basically you join a multiplayer server. Let's just say lobby for the sake of convenience, because it really is more of a lobby. And a lobby can hold at most 16 players. Those are 16 players that can roam around the map freely and actually join race playlists. And these race playlists are then kept to 8 players. And if you want to play with friends, it's kept to 4 players. So you can only have like 4 players in your party. And I think this system, this has been brought up multiple times, it's not like anything new that I'm saying, but I think it's this system that I think really does not do Unbound any favors. In previous Need for Speeds, you could basically just enter a menu and you can just go into multiplayer and you can start queuing for a race playlist or, you know, whatever, and it would then match you up with players that are also currently looking for playlists, no matter where they are, if they're on the same server. Like, none of that really mattered. The way it works now is you can basically start a playlist or look for races, and then that invite, quote unquote, will only go out to the 16 people tops that are currently in the same lobby with you, which is not really ideal, because you never know what these people might be doing, right? Like, some people might be busy doing something in the garage and may not want to like actually accept a race invite. And especially now with the cops being added in multiplayer, I think a lot of people are going to be busy with the cop chases in online and aren't actually going to accept playlists because they're running away from the cops. So the matchmaking, sadly, is still something that I think could use some improvements. Sadly, if you know like a little bit about like way game development works, that stuff is server side, and anything that has anything to do with the servers and the way they're structured is really hard to work on. So I honestly wouldn't get my hopes up that this is going to be fixed with the next update. I hope so. But yeah, it just remains to be seen. But what about my own personal opinion? Well, if you have followed me for a little while, you know that I was kind of like meh on Unbound. Like, I played it for I think like about 8 hours, and I just wasn't really warming up with it. That's mainly due to the way the single player worked. Like, if you know some of my favorite games like Gran Turismo 4, Pro Street, or Forza Horizon, like, these games are a lot more open, basically. Sure, you have like an economy and you have to do like good decisions, and you can't just, it's not like, you know, the modern Horizon games where you just kind of can do whatever you want. But they do give you like a lot more freedom, and with the way Unbound's initial career worked, it wasn't really like that. Like, the game gave you like very little amounts of money, and you kind of had to do things a very specific way. Don't spend too much on customization in the beginning. Like, it was very, very restrictive. And some people might like that because it does actually make the game more challenging and you actually have to think about what you're doing. but it just wasn't for me. It wasn't anything for me personally. And then also seeing what the state of the multiplayer was at the time, and you know, without all the fixes that I've been mentioning in this video, I didn't really have that much motivation to keep playing, sadly. But now that I actually got around to check out the update a week early over this weekend, I gotta say I actually had quite a lot of fun. It's pretty interesting. The cops in multiplayer were absolutely chaotic. I remember I was in a chase with, I think, Game Riot and Black Panther at one point. And despite us just being like 3 dudes, the map was completely littered with cops. Like the entire city was on a total lockdown. And it was just a blast. It was probably like the best cops I've seen in a multiplayer in quite a while. Like, it's actually really well implemented. What I also really liked about the multiplayer cops was that you actually now get cash when you crash out cops, which I think is something that also should have been in the base game, especially in the single player, and I hope they also transfer that over to the single player. But basically now, if you manage to wreck a cop, you basically just get $200 for every cop wrecked, which is cool in concept, but I think it needs a little bit more of refining. $200 for each cop wrecked isn't really that much. It really doesn't add up that well. I think instead what they should probably consider doing is that you get different amounts of money depending on the type of cop that you wrecked. Like if you just wreck like a regular city cruiser, like one of the condition 1 cops, you just get $200. But if you wreck like one of the faster Corvettes, or maybe even like one of the, you know, one of the Raptors, you actually get more, maybe like 1,000, 2,000. I'm not sure how they would balance that exactly, but just getting more money depending on the type of cop that you wrecked just makes sense in my opinion. And then last Sunday I was also doing some races with LPN and Pixelhelden, and I actually gotta say that the races were pretty fun. They definitely feel more rewarding now that the payouts have been increased, and multiplayer races feeling rewarding is extremely important. Like if you do a race and, you know, worst case you get last, wouldn't be me, by the way. And then you basically just get scraps. It just doesn't really feel very... It just doesn't motivate you to continue playing. But now that the payouts have increased and you actually get like a semi-decent amount even if you lose, it's honestly great. And I felt the races were a lot more rewarding and fun as a result. And the reason why I think this is actually a good update is because usually update supports for previous Need for Speed games have been pretty bad, unfortunately. One thing that I read a lot, for whatever reason, and heard a lot, is that this is basically the same as Heat. How? Actually, how? Let's go back to when Heat got its handful of updates. We got 2 cars with only a small handful of challenges for each of them, minor quality of life improvements that almost no one noticed, and the cops, although they were in the multiplayer at launch, were nowhere near as good as the ones that we now have in Unbound, because the damage system in Heat was just much worse. Like, it was way too easy to take damage from even the tiniest things in Heat, which admittedly made for pretty exciting cop chases, especially in the single player. But now with damage just making more sense and you being able to ram cops without taking any damage really, it makes the cops in Unbound's multiplayer way more fun. And then another comment that I heard a lot is that this is basically all content that should have been in the game at launch. Well, yeah, but you can say that about pretty much anything. If you really think about it, anything, any update that any game ever gets could have been in the base game, like, but that's just not how updates and DLC work. At the end of the day, they wanted to release Unbound at the end of 2022, and what we got was what we had. The only thing that I feel is just unfortunate is, you know, stuff that was in Heat at launch and then not in Unbound at launch, like the cops in multiplayer. That's like the only thing where I'd be like, yeah, maybe this should have been there at launch, but look, I'm just happy regardless that this game is getting any kind of support and any kind of love, because it feels like something we have not really seen in years when it comes to the Need for Speed series. So the way I see it is that with Unbound and Volume 2, it actually somewhat feels like a return to form. It feels like they actually care this time around and actually want this game to be better, especially as I outlined. They actually fixed the stuff that people complain about, which is sadly kind of unprecedented. So overall, I just think in terms of updates, this is a big improvement over previous Need for Speeds, and that's just something that I generally appreciate. And I also think that I'm cautiously optimistic as a result when it comes to the future of the game, especially because now they did fix a lot of the major issues. Obviously, there's still some work to be done, which is fine, but most of the major stuff is kinda gone. And now they can actually think about expanding the game, which I think is a good point to be at. But if we were to already kind of start talking about the updates, which comes after this, I think the next update really should consider adding some replay value. It doesn't even need to be anything like mind-blowing, Like I honestly don't really need like a map expansion, for example, but just some stuff like new modes, you know, new kind of like event types that you can participate in. Maybe even special multiplayer events, you know, kind of like Forza Horizon has them, just for fun. And obviously a big one that I think everyone is kind of thinking about, pink slip races in online. That would be the non-plus ultra, and I think that's something absolutely everyone would love. You can probably already tell from just my ideas that Unbound definitely still has a lot more potential. And I really hope that Criterion grasps the potential that is actually in Unbound and continues to deliver great updates, you know, during the rest of the year. Because look, I know I'm covering like a lot of old games on the channel, but I just want new games to be as great as they can be, just as much as the next guy. I really do think that Criterion is on the right track with Unbound. They have their head in the right space, and I think they are capable, certainly, of you know, continuing to do great updates for the game. And yeah, I hope that next time I can make a video on another Unbound update, I can be just as positive. But yeah, that should cover all of my thoughts about Need for Speed Unbound. Thank you once again to EA for letting me check out the update early. Much appreciated. And I hope that was helpful to some of you. But now I want to know your opinion. Do you think this is a good update? Will this actually get you back into Need for Speed Unbound? I'd love to hear all of your opinions down in the comments below. But yeah, make sure it's been fun. Until we meet again. Bye everyone.